Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 2nd of July 2012, the podcast that melts in your mouth, not in your hand. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's unfairly compete with the news of the bogus. So President Obama gave $9 billion in so-called stimulus money to solar and wind projects in order to create jobs and help us out of the recession. How well did it work? Well, despite Obama and his followers shouting from the hills that he saved us all from perpetual depression, it turns out that every job he created cost the taxpayers $9.8 million. In a report by the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the program provided about $9 billion to over 23,000 alternative energy projects. They found out that this stimulus money only created 910 new jobs, which means that each new job cost the taxpayers $9.8 million. But they also found that 4,600 jobs were indirectly created by the stimulus. Totaling them together, that's 5,510 jobs directly or indirectly created by the stimulus, about $1.63 million per job. And since it was given to over 23,000 different projects, that means there was only one job created for every 4.2 projects. Over 75% of the projects that got the federal money didn't create a single job. This is how well government stimulus spending works. It doesn't. These figures don't even take into account what the $9 billion would have been spent on or invested in the private sector and how many jobs would have been created that way. As we've said before in this podcast, government can't even stimulate the companies it gives the money to directly. How can it possibly be said to stimulate the entire economy? When government isn't stifling jobs, it's ruining lives in other ways, like putting 13-year-old girls in jail for cutting another girl's hair. That's what happened to Caitlin Lopin, who helped a friend cut some hair off the back of a friend's ponytail and ended up being jailed for 30 days, forced to undergo a strip search, and even have her own ponytail cut off completely in court in full view of the public. It happened at a McDonald's play area where another girl had the scissors and just cut off a piece of their friend's hair. Lopin never even held the scissors. Yet 2 weeks later, police officers came to her school and told her that her friend's parents were pressing charges. What? At the juvenile court hearing, Judge Scott Johansson ordered the girl's mother to cut off her entire ponytail. He also ordered Lopin to 30 days juvenile detention, a $350 fine, and 276 hours of community service. He reduced that last one to 150 hours if the mother cut the ponytail in front of the victim's parents. The other girl's mother kept demanding that more hair be cut off, and the judge kept agreeing with her. Remember that Lopin did not cut her friend's hair. The probation officer said that it all was valid, though, because she was, quote, guilty by association. Folks, guilt by association is something that fascist dictatorships do. That concept has absolutely no place anywhere in the judicial system of any country that wants to call itself free. What the hell is going on in juvenile court? This is something that should never even have been brought to the attention of police, and if it did, the police should have responded only with a shrug. The fact that the judge did anything other than dismiss the case and tell the parents to grow up is shameful. To have Lopin undergo the embarrassment of a public removal of her ponytail is staggeringly cruel. What is this, medieval Japan? Oh, and the other girl, the one who actually did the cutting, was sentenced by the same judge to have her hair cut, but she got to have it done in a salon. Unbelievable. Now, little Caitlin is having to live with the trauma of her experience. According to her mother, she won't even sleep by herself. She cries and gets upset a lot of the time. Subjected to public embarrassment, removal from her mother, and a strip search has taken their toll on her 13-year-old mind. This same judge back in 2007 ordered a mother who was homeschooling her children to either enroll her in public schools or lose custody entirely. That mother ended up fleeing the state to keep her child. The judge was also publicly reprimanded in 1997 for physically slapping a boy on the face. How does someone like that get to keep being a judge? Caitlin's mother had already grounded her for her behavior. She even said she would be willing to have her daughter's hair cut in the salon as punishment, to the same length as the other girl had to have her hair cut. She went into juvenile court thinking there would be an appropriate punishment being given, even though she herself had already punished her daughter. Now, after this experience, she's filed a complaint with the Utah Judicial Conduct Commission. Best of luck to her, and here's hoping this horrible judge finally gets thrown off the bench, like he should have been years ago. The purpose of juvenile court is not to punish or traumatize, but to give the child a positive direction for future behavior. This sort of eye for an eye, two wrongs make a right sentence does not do that. And that sort of behavior by the courts, regardless of whether or not it's juvenile or adult court, should not be tolerated. The woman screaming is 30-year-old Daisy Bram, and she's screaming because officers have just taken her 18-month-old toddler and her newborn baby away from her. Why? Because even though medical marijuana is legal in her state of California, Bram, a medical marijuana patient, was arrested for child endangerment because she was also breastfeeding her infant.
Daisy, baby doll, listen, look at me. I know, listen to me. You listen to me.
My baby.
Daisy, my mother can come get you. Please calm down.
What's gonna eat?
Yeah, baby doll, you can get out of jail.
This is temporary.
What's he gonna eat? He has to eat now. He's a newborn.
This isn't even a case of the federal government overruling state law. These were policemen for Butte County, not the feds. Bram is a registered medical marijuana patient. The whole thing is turned into a joke from start to finish. Initially, the judge had dropped the child endangerment charges, leaving just the marijuana possession, but the prosecutors managed to get it added back after some of the newborn's hairs tested positive for marijuana. But Bram never even hid the fact that she was breastfeeding. In fact, she specifically told him otherwise as they were taking her baby from her, that she wanted him to be breastfed and not formula fed. And she never denied the marijuana use either. Why should she? She's a marijuana patient. So this is the excuse they have for the child endangerment charge, even though there has never been one single death in all of human history attributed to the toxicity of marijuana. That plus the fact they couldn't even agree on the dates of the hair samples, nor could they prove chain of custody. The case took a turn for the surreal when the prosecutor gave evidence about her husband's marijuana plants, even though it was her and not her husband who was on trial. Supposedly, they were also trying to say that the kids might have gotten THC in their system by eating the marijuana buds, even though it has to be heated for the THC to be released, as Humboldt and Mendocino County physician William Courtney testified. Quote, "The amount you would have to eat would be physically impossible. It tastes horrible." And then, get this, DA investigator Eric Clay, one of the officers in the raid, said that having that much marijuana was endangering the kids because it could attract armed robbers. Jesus, juice, and Christ crackers, is having an expensive stereo endangering as well? As of this podcast's recording, the hearing is still ongoing. Personally, I think the fact that the judge hasn't thrown it all out as a cruel joke is a bad sign. Still, good luck to Brammy getting all of this tossed and getting her children back. It seems that the reports of horrific behavior in socialized medicine countries just gets harder and harder to believe. But according to multiple news outlets, at least one doctor in Britain's NHS system, Professor Patrick Pulicino, is blowing the whistle on NHS doctors prematurely ending the lives of elderly patients in order to free up beds. The problem with government-run healthcare is keeping costs down, but the only way government has of reducing costs is rationing, which means deciding who needs care and who doesn't. The NHS created the Liverpool Care Pathway as a way of managing terminally ill patients in the final days of their lives. But according to Pulicino, it's not being used to help patients, but to free up beds and hospital resources for other patients. And this care mostly consists of withholding water and nutrients until the patient dies up to 33 hours later. Each year, about 130,000 patients die on this care plan. Theoretically, all 130,000 were going to die within days anyway, as patients are supposed to be placed on this pathway only when recovery is impossible and death is imminent. You know, even at that, it still sounds kind of inhumane. Euthanizing terminal patients by turning up the morphine drip can lead to a quick, peaceful, pain-free death, but just letting them die of dehydration? Can't be pleasant. But Pulicino claims that often elderly patients who could live longer are placed on the care pathway because of, quote, pressure on beds and difficulty with nursing confused or difficult to manage elderly patients. If this is true, it's beyond horrific. If a hospital in the US did this, it would be considered murder. Pulicino claims that he personally intervened to take a 71-year-old pneumonia and epilepsy patient off the LCP. He said that the family was upset because they hadn't agreed to place him on the care pathway. According to Pulicino, quote, I removed the patient from the LCP despite significant resistance. And what happened? The patient was successfully treated. Quote, his seizures came under control, and 4 weeks later, he was discharged home to his family. It's tempting to think of this experience as a one-time error, but the fact is, if the procedures allow it to happen once, it probably happens a lot. Pulicino's patient lived another 14 months. Then he got pneumonia again, was sent to a different hospital, was put on the LCP again, and died. Pulicino told the Royal Society of Medicine, quote, the lack of evidence for initiating the Liverpool care pathway makes it an assisted death pathway rather than a care pathway. Very likely, many elderly patients who could live substantially longer are being killed by the LCP. Patients are frequently put on the pathway without a proper analysis of their condition. This determination in the LCP leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we accept the Liverpool care pathway, we accept that euthanasia is part of the standard way of dying as it is now associated with 29% of NHS deaths. Pulicino isn't the first to criticize the Liverpool care pathway. Professor Pete Millard of the University of London and Dr. Peter Hargraves of St. Luke's Cancer Center warned 3 years ago that the LCP constituted, quote, backdoor euthanasia. They warned of the risk of economic factors, and not patient health, being used to determine who is placed on this care pathway. There is evidence of this being a systematic problem. Families are always supposed to be consulted before placing a patient on the LCP, but according to a study done by the Marie Curie Palliative Care Institute Liverpool and the Royal College of Physicians, 1 out of 4 patients placed on the LCP were placed there without the families even being told about it. They also found that in one trust, half the families weren't informed, and in 1/4 of the trusts, 1 in 3 families were not informed. According to a spokesperson for the Department of Health, quote, patients and their families should always be involved in any decision about the end-of-life care. The audit rightly highlights the continuing importance of training for staff and the critical role they have in involving patients and families closely when the Liverpool care pathway is used. Hey, I'm all for better training on this, but really, how much training do you need in order to not deliberately kill a patient? And of course, this all fits with the overall trend of the NHS, like all government healthcare systems, having to ration care in some way, because there just aren't enough resources to go around. According to Mike Farrar, chief executive of the NHS Confederation, the NHS, quote, looks like a supertanker heading for an iceberg. Despite huge efforts to maintain standards of patient care in the current financial year, healthcare leaders are deeply concerned about the storm clouds that are gathering around the NHS. Many NHS leaders see finances as getting worse and that this is already having a growing impact on their patients. We have actually got a situation where relatively poor people are spending all their assets to pay for their care. Gee, I thought that only happened with evil, greedy market healthcare systems like the US. It just isn't good policy to try and make end-of-life decisions in such a manner. According to a letter several doctors sent to the British newspaper The Telegraph back in 2009, quote, a nationwide wave of discontent is building up as family and friends witness the denial of fluids and food to patients. Syringe drivers are being used to give continuous terminal sedation without regard to the fact that the diagnosis could be wrong. Experienced doctors know that sometimes, when all but essential drugs are stopped, dying patients get better. I'm in favor of euthanasia as long as it's done humanely and with the fully informed consent of the terminally ill patient's loved ones. Unfortunately, it looks like none of these is the case here. Patients are being starved instead of humanely euthanized, it's being done without the consent or sometimes even the knowledge of the patient's loved ones, and it's been shown to be used in cases where the patient could make a full recovery. This is far from the first time this podcast has reported on this kind of problem happening in government healthcare systems all over the world. It's time for people to stop worshiping at the altar of universal healthcare and opening their eyes to the real systematic problems that permeate it. And now it's time to blow out the candles of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. Paul Krugman is becoming known in some circles as the Sylvia Browne of economics, for like that psychic fraud, but I repeat myself, he has consistently gone back to his failed predictions to try and make it look like he was right all along. Like when he tried to claim he predicted the housing crisis, when he really said the housing bubble was a way to avoid an economic crisis. Now, with all the smarmy arrogance of Kent Hovind and all the integrity of Baron Munchausen, he's trying to claim, yet again, that his claims about fiscal responsibility, which he calls austerity, causing economic harm, are right after all. Just listen to what he says. Quote, "Intellectually it was, I think I can say without false modesty, a huge win. I, and those of like mind, have been right about everything." Someone needs to let Krugman know what the word modesty means. I guess he was technically right. He did say it without false modesty. He said it without any kind of modesty at all. Let's go back to the article he links to from 2 years ago. Here he talks about investors pulling out on governments as they become less solvent, whom he calls bond vigilantes. Yeah, like they're careless lawbreakers or something, as opposed to investors seriously worried about their livelihoods. Quote, "What the advocates of austerity claim is that A, the bond vigilantes are about to attack America." Wait, attack? Not letting government borrow your money is an attack? Jeez. Back to the quote. "And B, spending anything more on stimulus will set them off. What reason do we have to believe that any of this is true?" Well, let's see. The U.S. has had its credit rating downgraded to AA+ by S&P and just to AA by Egan-Jones. That's not a good sign. He then goes on with his bogus austerity metrics, like using Ireland as an example of austerity when they've increased both their overall spending and their debt every single year, and saying that Estonia has, quote, "done even worse," when in last week's podcast we showed that this was just not the case. So it looks like all of the predictions from this 2-year-old article have failed. And what does he do in this latest article to support his claim that he was right? Nothing. He just claims it. He calls the current rampant increase in spending and debt, quote, "a terrible wrong turn in policy," when in reality it's just a few percent less than what the increase would have been otherwise. He bemoans the fact that the people who are speaking out in favor of fiscal responsibility haven't been discredited yet, but ends by patting himself and others who agree with him on the back, quote, "well done." Really, that sort of arrogance, that hideously bloated ego, and either a blind refusal to look at the facts or a complete lack of compunction about telling deliberate lies just to make himself look good, can only mean that, for the second week in a row, the first time this has happened, Paul Krugman is this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to accelerate the accedents to this week's Extraordinaire. And once again, it goes to a nutty group of creationists. Are there any groups of creationists that aren't nutty? Called the Accelerated Christian Education Program. They have developed a curriculum in the state of Louisiana that will teach children that Darwin's theory of evolution is false because of, get this, the Loch Ness Monster. Yes, they're being taught that Nessie is real and disproves evolution. One of the textbooks says, quote, "Are dinosaurs alive today?" Actually, yes, birds are still around. Somehow I don't think that's what they meant. Anyway, continuing. "Scientists are becoming more convinced of their existence. Have you heard of the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland? Nessie, for short, has been recorded on sonar from a small submarine, described by eyewitnesses, and photographed by others. Nessie appears to be a plesiosaur." No it hasn't. We have only a few blurry pictures, the most famous of which is a known fake, and no sonar images whatsoever showing any creature of that size in the loch. There wouldn't even be enough food to sustain one of them. Even that ridiculous Noah's Ark story understands you need at least 2. It also claims that a Japanese whaling boat once caught a dinosaur. Yeah, in a Godzilla movie, maybe. One of the kids raised in this curriculum, Johnny Scaramanga, is now 27 and speaks out against fundamentalist Christianity. Quote, The reason for that is they're saying if Noah's flood only happened 4,000 years ago, which they believe literally happened, then possibly a sea monster survived. If it was millions of years ago, then that would be ridiculous. That's their logic. It's a common thing among creationists to believe in sea monsters. The curriculum is followed by several private religious schools in the state. They receive public voucher money, which means that the curriculum is approved by the Louisiana State Board. It should come as no surprise that they teach other nutty things, like the fact that homosexuality is a, quote, learned behavior. That should come as a surprise to every gay person ever. More darkly, some of the textbooks even praise the Ku Klux Klan. Quote, the Klan in some areas of the country tried to be a means of reform, fighting the decline in morality and using the symbol of the cross. In some communities, it achieved a certain respectability as it worked with politicians. I don't think any commentary is even needed here. Yes, the creationists are still out there in force, and they're so desperate they have to put complete myths like the Loch Ness Monster in their school books. After that, how could anyone else in the world possibly be this week's Idiot Extraordinaire? Well, that wraps up this evolving, revolving, involving, resolving, absolving, unsolving, and devolving edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums of Bogosity.tv where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Richard Feynman. It does not matter who you are, or how smart you are, or what title you have, or how many of you there are, and certainly not how many papers your site has published. If your prediction is wrong, then your hypothesis is wrong. Period. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Imported License. Bogosity.